Well, this is week number 6 in our study called Getting Along. We're looking at 8 biblical solutions to conflict. And we are today going to look at how conflict arises and how conflict continues because of poor listening skills and poor communication skills. And one of the worst examples of this that we can see in the Bible is found in Joshua chapter 22 in the Old Testament. I told you 6 weeks ago when I began this series, it actually was birthed out of a personal daily devotional time that I was doing really just for myself. The Bible's filled with stories. Most of those stories are about people, and most of those stories are about people who get into conflict with each other. And so I got curious about whether there were some principles that I could learn and as a teacher pass on to other people. And so I started with page 1 and in the Bible, and anytime I got to a story about people in conflict, I just parked there and I camped out there for my morning devotional, and I asked that passage some questions. I asked, what created this conflict? And what were the consequences of this conflict? And if the conflict got resolved, how did it get resolved? And that was just a really enriching time for me, but as for all of us who teach the Bible, those personal devotional times over time became Bible lessons. And so this series that we're in right now called Getting Along started about a decade ago when I was first going through just to see what the Bible had to say about conflict. And if you do that yourself, if you're just starting on page 1 in the Bible and you're just going to wherever there's references to and stories about conflict, one of the first stories that you're going to get to very soon is here in Joshua chapter 22. Now in chapter 22 of Joshua, it records a time right after the conquest of the Promised Land, and the tribes of Reuben and Gad and half of Manasseh have been promised land east of the Jordan River. But Joshua asks them to combine together with the western forces until all of the land is pacified, until all the land is taken over. And then when that happens, Joshua sends with his blessing these tribes, Reuben and Gad and half of Manasseh, over to the eastern side of the Jordan River so they can start establishing their tribes and their homes there. And he says, you can go home. Thank you for your help. And they do that, and one of the first things, according to Joshua 22, one of the first things they do is build what verse 10 calls an imposing altar. Now look at verses 11 and 12, and notice how the western tribes reacted. When the Israelites heard that they had built the altar on the border of Canaan at Goliath, near the Jordan on the Israelite side, the whole assembly of Israel gathered at Shiloh to go to war against them. So the western tribes, they organized this delegation of 11 men, a priest named Phinehas and one delegate from each of the western tribes, and they go to the eastern tribes, and look at verse 16. They say, how could you break faith like this? How could you turn away from the Lord and build yourselves an altar in rebellion against him now? And they go on in this long formalized speech to compare what the eastern tribes had done to the sin of Peor and the unfaithfulness of Achan. Now these are stories from earlier in Judges and also in the book of Numbers, where there were individual people in the nation of Israel or small groups of people in the nation of Israel who did some wrong, they did some sin, and the entire nation did not respond quickly enough to excise that cancer out of the body, and so the entire body suffered. The entire body fell under the judgment of God. And so the western tribes thought they were under that kind of risk again. They saw their eastern tribal neighbors building this imposing altar, and they thought they were in the process of committing apostasy. There was only one place where sacrifices were legitimately allowed to be lifted up, and that was at the altar in the tabernacle. That tabernacle happened to be on the western side of the Jordan. And so the western tribes, they see this imposing altar being built on the eastern side of the river, and they immediately assume that their eastern neighbors are engaged in some sort of sin, a sin that's going to bring the judgment of God down on all of them, and they assemble to go to war. Now, in verse 22, immediately the eastern tribes, they respond to this delegation that's come over. This delegation has come over. They've given this big formal speech of reprimand. The western tribes are all aligned behind them, ready to go to war. And what do the eastern tribes say? Look at verse 22. The mighty one, God, the Lord, he knows, and let Israel know. And they go on to say, this is not true. We built a replica of the altar. We weren't building something to offer sacrifices to. We built something to remind our people that we are allied with you. But the tabernacle is on the western side of the river, and so we were building something to commemorate and remind our people that we are all part of the same people of God, of Israel. And then in verse 33, notice this, the western tribes lower their swords, and they look at each other, and they look at the eastern tribes and say, oh, never mind. Actually, they say they were glad to hear this report, and they praise God, and they talk no more about going to war. Now, here's a classic case of a conflict that arose from poor communication. The bridges between these people, so to speak, had collapsed. They had broken down, and it led them right to the brink of civil war. So who was at fault, the western tribes or the eastern tribes? They both were. I mean, the western tribes jumped to conclusions. Now, they sent a delegation, but this delegation didn't go to investigate. This delegation didn't go to ask questions and to listen and inquire. They just went to accuse. They, as far as they were concerned, already knew what was going on, and they were taking action. On the other hand, the eastern tribes just assumed that their neighbors would know why they were building this imposing altar, and they didn't communicate with the western tribes at all about it. And the sad truth is, this story is played out over and over again in our marriages, in our workplaces, in school, in our sports clubs, at church, anywhere where people come together. Conflict can often arise and stay unmanaged because of unsubstantiated assumptions. So what do we need to do to overcome this problem? We need hearing aids and we need megaphones. Hearing aids and megaphones. The western tribes could have used some hearing aids. The eastern tribes could have used some megaphones. So let's talk first about hearing aids. The western tribes could have used some of this. Did you notice, like I said, that the western tribes, they sent this delegation, but not for listening, not for investigation, for accusation. Because as far as they were concerned, they already knew what was going on, and all they needed to do was simply take action. And that's so typical. We see something going on at work, and we immediately assume the worst, and we're at odds with each other. Or we hear something about some new plan at church, and we immediately assume the worst. And we assemble our forces by email or assemble people out in the halls of the parking lot, and we're in civil war, right? We haven't checked it out. We haven't explored it. We haven't investigated it. But we're like the western tribes. We assemble for war. James chapter 1, verse 19. This is in your notes. It says, "My dear brothers, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry." Notice there are three things that we're supposed to do there. Quick to listen, number one. Number two is slow to speak. And then number three is slow to become angry. Guess what? I have found it's a lot easier to do the third action if I'm already doing the first two actions. If I'm quick to listen and slow to speak, I'm most definitely going to be slow to become angry. So how can we be better at being quick to listen? How can we put on some better hearing aids? I remember a stand-up comic one time who said, "Last night my girlfriend broke up with me. She said it was because I didn't listen to her." I think that's what she said. I'm not sure. Now, how can we become better listeners? We need 5 hearing aids. Let's write these down on our notes. First of all, waiting. By the way, most of these points come from Ken Sand's book, The Peacemaker. I've mentioned it to you before in this series, a really useful book for you to get hold of. Hearing aid number 1 is waiting. Waiting. We need to learn to wait patiently while others are speaking. Proverbs chapter 15, verse 28 says, "The godly think before speaking, the wicked spout evil words." So there are several ways that we can improve our waiting ability as we listen to people speak. One is try not to jump to premature conclusions about what they are saying. They're speaking and you're already just drawing conclusions. You already know where this is going, or so you think. Slow down and try not to jump to those premature conclusions. Discipline yourself not to interrupt people in the midst of what they're saying. You know, when you are frustrated or angry about something, you've probably been thinking about it for a while. And so therefore, you're really clear with your words. But you've sprung this. You're confronting somebody, you've sprung this on them. And so they may be groping for words, trying to figure out how to say their side of the story. So discipline yourself not to interrupt them. Learn to be comfortable with silence. Don't respond the moment there's a pause. That gives somebody the impression, by the way, that you weren't listening. You were just waiting for them to take a breath so you could give your impression of the story. Don't do that. And then don't offer immediate solutions anytime somebody brings a problem to you. Some of us are fixers. And I don't mean that this is, gender differentiated between males or females, but some of us are fixers. And so when somebody starts talking about a problem, instead of just taking time to listen and letting them unburden themselves, sometimes we just jump in to start fixing it right away. Maybe if we're going to be slow to speak, we need to not do that so quickly and easily all the time. Hearing aid number 2, attending. The challenge for those of us who are public speakers like me, those who are school teachers like many of you, the challenge is, and this has been proven by science, is that the mind thinks 4 times faster than the mouth can speak. And so if you're a school teacher and you're trying to convey a lesson, you've got a bunch of students out in front of you whose mind is already wandered off real quickly because they're thinking 4 times faster than you're able to speak. And that's true when it comes to being a public speaker or a pastor as well. Now, if you're in one-on-one conversation with somebody with whom you are in conflict and they are speaking, you just got to be mindful of the fact that your mind can wander so easily because your mind is thinking 4 times faster than that person is speaking. And so there are several ways that you can show that you're paying attention when other people are speaking. One is to maintain regular eye contact with the person who is speaking. Another is to avoid negative body language, such as folding your arms, which kind of indicates that you're closed off to what they have to say. Tapping your foot, which means you're sort of impatient and dismissive of what they have to say. Looking around. These are body language things that signal to somebody else that you're not really paying attention or not terribly interested in what they have to say. One of the things you can do to communicate to people that you're listening to them is to eliminate distractions as much as possible. Turn off the television set. Mute your phone. Turn it face down so the screen is down. Close the door so that there's not so much noise around you. Make sure you're positioned in such a way that you're looking at the person and not always going to be looking elsewhere when you're easily distracted. Leaning forward slightly usually shows interest, and warm and responsive facial expressions do as well. Nod your head occasionally, indicating to the person that you are engaged in what they have to say. All of these things will encourage them to continue talking. And isn't that the point? To hear them, to understand them, to get their perspective. So that's hearing aid number 2. Hearing aid number 3, clarifying. Clarifying is the process of making sure that you understand what the other person is trying to say. And this usually involves asking questions or making statements, things like, now, are you saying this? Or tell me more about this. Or can you give me an example? So somebody accuses you of being insensitive at work and you say, can you give me an example? And you're really asking. You're not being defensive. You're not like arguing against them. You're just wanting to understand their perspective a little bit more. Ask for an example. I'm confused about this. Let me see if I understand this. So words like this show that you're hearing them. You're thinking about what's being said. And these responses show that you are interested in getting more information from them so that you can understand them better. And that moves us in relation to hearing aid number 4. Hearing aid number 4 is reflecting. Reflecting is just paraphrasing back in your own words what you think you're hearing that person say. Now, understand, this does not mean that you are necessarily agreeing with them at any point or at all points, but what you want to do is to be able to echo back to them what you think that they are saying. So that when you echo it back to them and they say, no, that's not what I mean at all, well, you can continue the conversation, continue to ask questions. You're not really ready to respond to them until you can paraphrase back to them their perspective in such a way that they go, I couldn't have said it better myself. And that really, we are not trained to do that these days. We're not trained to do that in our culture. where do we go for most of our entertainment, for most of our news? People who are shouting at each other. People who are making caricatures of the other side. People are making these shallow accusations against what the other side is saying, right? We are being discipled by them all the time. That's our form of news/entertainment. And because of that, then we're not trained in this type of listening where we try to paraphrase back to somebody the way they understand something until they say, yeah, I couldn't have said that better myself. You summed it up really well. Now, again, you're not agreeing at this point. You're just communicating to them in such a way that they know that you really understood them. Here's hearing aid number 5, agreeing. Now, this doesn't mean agreeing at every point. And you might have your mind changed. You might agree with everything that they have to say at that point. They may give you a revelation that you never knew before. But the reality is that if somebody is issuing a complaint, there might be something there that you can agree with, even if you need to go on and talk about those things with which you disagree. And so acknowledge that. You know, you're right. I was wrong when I said such and such. You know, a lot of what you said is true, and I need to work on that. Phrases like this, they're not patronizing. They're ways of honestly indicating that you heard something in there that you agree with. Now, this isn't easy. Proverbs chapter 15, verse 31 says, listen to good advice if you want to live well. And sometimes that advice comes from the most unexpected places. That advice doesn't come from somebody who's fond of us and thinks that we do everything right. Sometimes that advice comes carefully couched in criticism. And if we can echo back to them some complaint that they've issued, and we can indicate to them that we have caught something in that we agree with and we intend to fix or change, that's going to take us a long way down toward getting along. So these are some hearing aids that will help us in our relationships with others. Waiting, attending, clarifying, reflecting, and agreeing. We need to let the story of Joshua chapter 22 convict us. The Western tribes didn't do any of this. And they were on the brink of civil war because they assumed that they knew what the Eastern tribes were doing. And all they had to do was go and fix what the Eastern tribes were doing wrong. And if they had just taken some time to investigate, none of this in Joshua chapter 22 would have happened. But the Eastern tribes have a share in the blame too. They proceeded to build this huge altar. Verse 10 called it not just an altar, but an imposing altar. And it just didn't occur to them to explain to the Western tribes what they were doing. Now, this is just insensitive. It's boneheaded on the part of the Eastern tribes. I mean, think about it. They built this huge replica of the tabernacle's altar, and we discover later on in the story that they did that with the best of intentions, to remind their people that they're part of larger Israel, and that there is an altar where sacrifices are made, and to remind people that they're connected to that. That was their intention, but we find that out later on in the story. I mean, what happens on an altar? Sacrifice happens on an altar. Worship happens around an altar. Why did it not occur to them that they would build this replica of an altar and not think that there would be some people who assumed that they were going to start breaking God's law and lifting up sacrifices on that altar? And so the Western tribes needed hearing aids, but the Eastern tribes needed megaphones. And so we need to learn how to listen to each other better, but we also need to learn how to speak better, how to communicate better our intentions. I put this in your sermon notes because it's so important. Ken Sand says, it is not good enough to communicate so that you can be understood. You should communicate so clearly that you cannot be misunderstood. Do you notice that? A lot of us, if we even have this as a goal, we try to communicate with the intention of being misunderstood. Ken Sand said that doesn't go far enough. We need to communicate in such a way that there's no way that we could be possibly misunderstood. Now, do we work that hard on communicating to other people? If the Eastern tribes had done that, would the incident in Joshua 22 had happened at all? No. And we do that as well. We don't do a good job trying to be understood, but we don't even try to do a good job of communicating in such a way that we can't possibly be misunderstood. Now, this is especially true if you're a leader. I work on this skill all the time, and still I have those points where no matter how often I communicate, no matter how early I communicate, no matter how carefully I communicate, I have somebody who misunderstands me. And that's when I'm at my best as a communicator. So imagine when I'm not doing all of those steps carefully. We need to make sure that we are paying attention to these things. So what are some megaphones that we can use to help people understand us? Megaphone number one, time. Time. Consciously build times for communication into your schedule. Think about the right time. Think about the right place to talk with people about what you need to talk with them about. You know, one of the absolute most common times that married couples talk with each other about a problem is also the worst time to talk with each other about a problem, and that's 10 minutes before each of you go to work. Now, somebody raises the issue because he or she is frustrated with it. It bothers him or her now, and so they raise it. But then all those emotions flare up, all those frustrations flare up. You don't have enough time to unpack everything and have everybody understand something. And now you're out the door and you're mad at each other for the rest of the day. And maybe you're not talking with each other when you come home at night. How about 10 minutes before you leave, schedule some time that you're going to talk about something. Even mark it down on your calendar so that you know at 7 p.m. this night, we're going to turn off the TV, we're going to turn off our phones or mute them, and we're going to have a conversation about this. You know, this issue of time, this megaphone of time, this is something that we get in trouble with sometimes as a church as well. Like I've told you a couple of times already in this series, we're not doing this series because there's any controversy that's going on behind the scenes in the church. And this series really isn't just about our relationships as a church. It's about wherever people get together, and families, at school, and sports teams, and at work, all of that kind of thing. But let me just use as an example, you know, the area that I know. My wheelhouse is church. And there are a lot of times, especially when I was younger in ministry, it still happens sometimes now, and a lot of times it happens with other leaders within the church where, you know, let's say we're in the deacon group, or we're in a committee, or we're together as a staff, and we identify something that needs to be dealt with in the church, something that needs to be fixed, and so we're getting ready to do this new program, make this new change, and it gets raised in committee meeting, and somebody disagrees, and so we talk about it and hash it out, and we pray some, and then talk about it some more, and pray some more, and somewhere along the way, that group of us, we've come to an agreement about what needs to happen. And we're excited about it, and we're convicted that God is leading us in this direction, and we present it to the church, and we want to get started next week. And what happens? People react negatively to it, and we're stunned, and we're offended, and it's entirely our fault because we didn't allow the rest of the church to go through that process, that time that we ourselves took. We weighed out things, we looked at various options, we discussed things, we worked through disagreements, we prayed about things as a small group. Now we need to allow the rest of the church that amount of time to go through that same process that they are only now first hearing about. You see? So we need to make sure one way we put a megaphone to our mouth is just simply to give each person enough time to think through what they need to hear. Megaphone number 2. Repetition. Repetition. Communicate in multiple ways. Again, just as an example, since church work is my wheelhouse, I'll say that sometimes somebody will say to me, "Nobody came to my event." I'll say, "Well, that's because you only started announcing it last week." And 4 days later, you've got to communicate more often than that. You've got to communicate at least 6 weeks early. People are just inundated, bombarded with information today. And so you need to get it out at least 6 weeks early so that at least 2 or 3 times across those 6 weeks, people are going to see that information. You've been planning for it for a long time. It's been on your calendar. You've gotten yourself excited about it. You know why people ought to be there. Nobody else knows that information. And so you need to communicate to them when it's happening, when the deadline is, why they need to be a part of it, and they need to hear it over and over and over again in order to want to participate with you in that particular thing. And not just one area like the newsletter. Just getting it in the newsletter, that's important, but for communication in church, we need to communicate it in other ways. How about on the on-screen announcements? How about going around to the different life groups and talking with them about, this is the last week to sign up for something? How about we post it on social media, or ask somebody who's an administrator for our church's social media to post it in that way. And the important thing is, don't just pay attention to the way that you receive information. Your way of receiving information may be the bulletin. I'm using church as an example here. But the important thing isn't you, the important thing is how somebody else receives information. Maybe they receive information through social media. Maybe they receive information through direct email or email to their group. Some years ago, I read about how this day and age that we are now deeply into is a time where there is no greater time for a great variety of ways of communicating, and no greater time for people not to listen to what each other's saying. And one of the reasons is we have to figure out now, where do people get their information? Do they prefer to be communicated with by, the email Hillcrest Happenings? Do they prefer to gain communication by text? My sons, they're in their early 30s. If I try to leave a voicemail, they'll never hear that. I have to send a text message to them. Some of you've tried to communicate with me through Facebook Messenger. Good luck, I may respond to you 4 weeks later. I just don't always check Facebook Messenger. How are the people you're trying to communicate with, how are they getting information? You need to make sure you're communicating in that way. Repetition. Megaphone number 3, preparation. Think carefully about your words. If you're getting ready to sit down with your marriage partner, if you're getting ready to sit down with a coworker at work and communicate something that's potentially emotional, potentially confrontational, you need to think through how you're going to say it, what words you're going to use, how you can say things in such a way that you will not be misunderstood. It's here that we need to know the difference between getting something off our chest and getting something into someone's heart. Some of us, we think that we have communicated because we just got something off our chest. We unloaded. And we got all those emotions out, but we didn't get a thing into somebody else's heart. In fact, their heart is more closed to us than ever before. And we just get this emotional release from getting something off our chest, but it's not communication. Communication is preparing yourself in such a way that you can speak in a way that they need to hear. Megaphone number 4, feedback. Feedback. After you've shared what you feel you need to share, ask for feedback. It's clear to you, but how will you know it's clear to them until you listen to what they have to say? And so ask some questions. I'm not sure I've said this clearly. Would you mind telling me what you think you heard me say? Have I confused you? What are you thinking about this? What have I said that you would agree with? What have I said that you would disagree with? These types of questions are a way of inviting them to hear or to speak to you about what they think that you were saying to them. Megaphone number 4. Megaphone number 5, face-to-face. Face-to-face. Talk in person whenever possible. I remember talking with a group of fellow pastors one time at a pastor's gathering, and we got on the subject of emails we wish we had never sent. You have any of those yourself? I remember reading one time a mom said that she was overhearing her little girl learning how to pray the Lord's Prayer. And the little girl said solemnly, "And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from email." I think some of us could be delivered sometimes from email, sending it and receiving it. Lauren Winter, in one of her articles, said that she wishes that all our email programs had a mandatory 24-hour waiting period. And so your email would be typed, it would just sit in that outbox for 24 hours before it was sent out. Now, she wasn't being serious, but wouldn't it be helpful sometimes to be able to grab back one of those emails inside 24 hours after you typed it out and then not send it, correct it, fix it, and that kind of thing? When email was fairly a new thing, I know this was a long time ago, but when email was fairly a new thing, I would usually take all this time when somebody would issue a complaint or ask this question, and I'd have these 3 or 4 paragraph emails, because I think that would be just this real efficient way to communicate to them a perspective on things. I don't do that anymore. I've learned these days that the only thing text messaging and email is good for is to set an appointment to talk face-to-face with someone. I mean, if you try to use email and you try to use text messaging to argue with somebody or to communicate frustration with somebody, you're just doing it wrong. You need to use that email or text messaging to set an appointment and visit in person with somebody as often as you can. So 5 megaphones to help us communicate loud and clear: time, repetition, preparation, feedback, and face-to-face. The point is that a lot of misunderstandings could be settled even before they start, and they could be settled after they've started. These misunderstandings could not even exist if we had better hearing aids and better megaphones. I've told you several times throughout this series that the absolute best way to learn how to get along with other people is to see how God gets along with us. And that's what makes these sermons that we're in on Sunday mornings different than TED Talks and self-help books. TED Talks are great. Self-help books are great. I've read a certain number of them myself. But a sermon is meant to point to Jesus. And looking at Jesus, how he relates to us, that's the best way to learn how to relate to other people. And so when it comes to this issue of hearing aids and megaphones, is Jesus a good example here as well? Absolutely. Think about hearing aids. Think about understanding our perspective and our point of view. The book of Hebrews tells us, Hebrews chapter 4, verse 15, we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way just as we are, yet he did not sin. Jesus entered into our lives. He experienced our experiences. You talk about somebody who knows how to listen, somebody who knows our perspective on things. Jesus shows us how to do it. And what about megaphones? Well, the same book of Hebrews, chapter 1, tells us this. In these last days, God has spoken to us, in what way? By his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, and through whom he made the universe. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. What's that mean? I think it was Paul Powell who said Jesus was God spelling himself out in language that we could understand. So you see, Jesus is the perfect example of how to have good hearing aids, how to understand somebody else's perspective. And Jesus is also the perfect example of how to communicate in a way that we can understand. He was God spelling himself out in language that we could understand. And so our homework, what we need to do as we walk out of this place is, number one, we need to enter into that relationship that Jesus is offering to us. You know, we broke that relationship with God through our sin and through our rebellion, but God didn't leave us alone. He came to us in the person of Jesus. He mended the relationship. He fixed it. And by faith, as we place our faith in Jesus Christ, we begin a relationship with God that we ourselves broke. So in order to get along with other people, the first thing we need to do is learn how God gets along with us. And then from that day on, after we become believers, we just spend the rest of our lives meditating over how God relates so perfectly to us, and then just mimic that in our relationships with other people. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Now, with heads bowed in prayer and eyes closed, like I said, our homework is to enter into a relationship with Jesus, or having entered into that relationship, we need to mimic it in our relationships with others. So, what's your homework assignment? Some of us, we need to enter into a relationship with Jesus for the first time. We realize that when it comes to getting along with others, that's important, but not near as important as getting along with God, our Maker, our Creator. And maybe we need to admit, we need to confess to him that we broke things off through our sin, our selfishness, our self-centeredness, our rebellion. We separated ourselves from God. And we need to say something like this: Dear Jesus, come into my life and be my Savior and Lord. Thank you for dying on the cross for me. You took away my sins on the cross. Give me a clean heart inside. Help me to begin my relationship with the Father from this day forward. But others of us, we prayed that prayer in some way, shape, or form, some years ago, some decades ago. But we really haven't looked at that relationship that God has with us, that God worked on with us, and we haven't really seen that as our model. We haven't seen that we need to mimic that. We need to reflect that. in how we relate to others, our marriage partners, our friends, our co-workers, our fellow church members, and so on. And so maybe we need to pray something like this. Dear Jesus, I thank you that when I broke things off with God, that you didn't leave me alone, that you came after me, that you worked on mending and fixing that broken relationship. And now, Lord, I ask that you would just help me to learn how to reflect that in the relationships I have, the challenging relationships I have with others. Enable me to have a better set of hearing aids and a better set of megaphones as I go out of this place today. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.